Good day. I'm Ken Caper, and this is DOOGAN'S Digest. And thank you for joining us this week's episode. I'm with MemoryWorks, and we started doing this about 5 episodes ago. And so thank you for tuning in and stick with us. We got a lot more coming. Just a quick pointer: the AFA, the Alzheimer's Foundation, just released their Care Quarterly magazine, which is a free subscription. You can go online and sign up free, and you'll get one every month. It's the only magazine that deals with dementia specifically that you can subscribe to for free. Just want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. We've got a big promotion this month of May running into June. We're actually going to run a competition based on the old tunes that most seniors have listened to, the old songs, the big bands, everything from the polka on down to the jitterbug and back, from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And we're calling it Name That Old Tune, and we're going to form teams. If you want to form a team, if you're curious, if you want to try to outguess fellow seniors, whether it's at a facility or a club or whatever, the only requirement is you be 70 years or older, and you form a team, and that's basically it. But we're going to do this as a fundraiser, so we're going to encourage you to go out and get sponsors for your team, and maybe even T-shirts, the whole works. And then in June, we're going to have a playoff similar to a bracket structure, and whoever is the winner is going to get a sizable prize. And we're looking at somewhere between $2,500 and $5,000 for a prize right now. Who knows, that may buy a vacation, maybe it'll buy something else you need. Not sure what it is, but there'll also be runner-up prizes. So join us for Name That Old Tune. You can find us on the internet at memoryworks.org, MEMORYWORKS.org. So let me jump right into our conversation today. I've invited a special guest, a very prominent guest, and I'm honored to have Scott Moody from the State Budget Solutions. I don't know if that's called a think tank, but it sounds like one. Scott is the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Economist at State Budget Solutions, and he's very interested in the economics of aging and the impact that the baby boom generation is going to have on the whole country, not just Maine. Certainly he's concerned about Maine. He used to work at the Maine Heritage Policy Center. He used to run that place. But he's also interested in New Hampshire, and I think he's going to tell us about a study coming up. He's Washington, D.C. based. What I did learn today is that he drives everywhere he goes rather than flying. And that's obviously an economics purpose. But Scott is very involved with media. He's been in the Portland Press Herald, the New Hampshire Union Leader, Hartford Courant, the Oklahoman, Albuquerque Journal, and more. If you want to find him, his website is www.statebudgetsolutions.org. And there's plenty of information as well as some of their other policy things. So let me introduce right now Scott Moody, Chief Economist for State Budget Solutions. And Scott, welcome to DOOGAN'S Digest.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks
I won't tell you who Doogan is, but Scott, earlier we were talking and you mentioned that you're interested in what's happening with the economics around seniors. I call it the silver tsunami because it's easier it kind of connects all the dots. But you said something about you're getting ready to do some sort of a study in New Hampshire. Tell me about that.
Absolutely.
Tell our audience.
Absolutely. And silver tsunami is a great term for what we're facing, particularly. So State Budget Solutions, we're a national think tank whose goal is to change the way state and local governments do business. And as you know, the reason is because a lot of government spending is on an unsustainable path, and in particular Medicaid. And so one of the things we want to look at is how is Medicaid and the aging of America going to coincide? And it's going to be more like a train wreck than anything else, because most people don't realize that Medicaid takes care of long-term care for the elderly. So that means nursing homes and other type of long-term care facilities are actually paid by Medicaid.
Not Medicare?
Not Medicare.
Medicaid.
That's right.
In Maine, that's Maine Care.
That's right.
Okay.
And it's actually quite easy to qualify, and there's actually a lot of games that are played in order for people to get on long-term care. But that being said, what's happening just with the aging of America is we can expect an explosion in long-term care spending through the Medicaid system.
I saw a number thrown out for Maine, at least, that we currently have about 205,000 people over age 65, but in the next 20 to 30 years, that's supposed to grow to 450,000 people over the age of 65.
That's right.
And I'll be honest with you, I have a hard time explaining that to the average Joe because that's kind of an overwhelming number, but in easy terms, if you take all the care services that are provided today, we need double that. We need to replicate that same system all over again in order to take care of doubling the population.
That's right. And what's troubling is for the Medicaid system is, number one, for the existing long-term care facilities, Medicaid does not pay enough to keep them afloat. So most people don't realize that Medicaid, 2/3 of Medicaid spending are actually on long-term and elderly services already. So to your point, that we're going to have to double that again means Medicaid spending is going to explode.
So I thought Medicaid was the welfare system. I didn't think it was an aging or system for seniors. So
Well,
it also does the senior.
It does, and that's because a lot of seniors are in poverty or below, qualify for Medicaid. And also the services for the elderly are the most expensive. And that's the thing, with whether you're talking about Obamacare or health insurance in general, we're always talking about the young people. But the young people rarely utilize health care. And they're
Compared to seniors.
yeah. They're relatively inexpensive. It's the end of life is where most healthcare expenditures are made in America. And therefore, that translates directly onto Medicaid. So what we're doing at State Budget Solutions is we're going to be doing a pilot study in New Hampshire, but this is all of northern New England. This is Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. We're the 3 oldest states, basically 1, 2, and 3 in the country. And so what we're going to do is a pilot study and look at how long-term care is going to explode under New Hampshire's Medicaid system. But we'll basically be able to put that in a photocopier, and you're going to get Maine's and you're going to get Vermont's out of that.
So you're going to look at just the Medicaid population, or not Medicare population, not the self-insured, the self-pay population?
That's right.
Just Medicaid.
Just the Medicaid, because that's where most long-term care expenditures are. And the Centers for Medicaid Services, I believe, does a 10-year look.
CMS.
CMS. Yeah. The problem is that 10-year window is just at the cusp of the aging problem. So they're basically missing.
They're missing it. Understood. I understand how government works.
And so we're going to try to fix that deficiency. It's not unprecedented to do a 30-year window. States already do it for their pension systems. We've talked a lot about Maine pensions over the years here and how, that 30-year window, you're looking at a huge unfunded liability. When we look at a 30-year window of Medicaid, we're going to find the same thing exists, that there's going to be a huge unfunded liability, and almost all that's going to be related to long-term care for the elderly.
Now, is that just because more people will be going on Medicaid, Maine Care, or is it because the cost of health care, they need to increase the amounts they pay?
I think it's going to be both. It's going to be both. I mean, healthcare is obviously one of the fastest growing expenditure-wise in the country, and it's a self-reinforcing phenomena, right? The elderly use the most medical services. We're going to get more elderly, therefore you're going to get more demand.
Right.
The problem, as you pointed out, particularly in a state like Maine, is the supply is not going to be able to keep up. I referenced earlier that Medicaid already is not paying enough to keep the nursing homes open, for example. 80% on average of the population is on Medicaid. They're relying on 20% of private long-term care holders to keep their doors open.
So I've got to make a specific point on this because Scott's right on about the shortage issue. And for those of you who aren't intricately entwined in this, you may not be aware there's about a 3-year waiting period now for a Medicaid bed in a nursing home. There's a huge shortage of beds already. Facilities are reluctant because they get paid, I think, $89 a day, I think is the reimbursement rate. And I may be wrong, but it's somewhere around that, $90 a day. And that's for everything. Room, board, food, medicine, everything. That's it. And not many people can live in an intense medical care environment at that rate. That's well below what even a hospital would charge for a one-day rate. And so we've got this huge shortage of Medicare beds. We also have, and you may have started to see some advertisements in papers and other publications, we've got a huge shortage of direct care workers. I see every day in the publications I get from around southern Maine, people are advertising for personal care support specialists or CNAs, and they've been hiring, historically, they've been hiring seniors to do that kind of work as sort of a retirement supplement. But those seniors are getting older, and there's less people stepping up to take those roles at this point. So and we aren't graduating enough, Scott, and that's a whole nother issue. We're not graduating a lot of kids into health sciences, so we're not doing ourselves any favor. And on top of all that, and you know this, the population of Maine has been declining. Mm-hmm. Well, if we need more workers and our population is declining, we're just not going to have enough workers. We're not going to have, what are we going to have?
And that's exactly right. And that's the other shoe that's going to be dropping, is the economic one.
Yeah.
In Maine is now one of only 2 states where there are more deaths than births occurring statewide. But when you look at it on a county basis, in 2014, the latest county data just came out a few weeks ago, 13 of Maine's 16 counties have more deaths than births. So to put an exclamation mark on your point, which is not only are fewer people going into these professions to care for the elderly, there are fewer people even available to go in. So you need a higher proportion of people to go into these kinds of jobs.
Yeah.
And I'm sure as you've pointed out in probably other shows, these aren't very well-paying jobs.
Oh,
either.
God, no.
So where is that supply going to come from? You're going to have a tremendous demand. And for Maine, the other problem is this is a rural problem, predominantly. We're talking about Aroostook. We're talking about Washington County. We're not talking about Portland. Right now. Portland is still a positive net population, but not by much, mind you. It's not very high because the state as a whole is negative.
But Portland's working on that. We're going to raise the minimum wage so that it'll scare business away.
That's not going to help. That's absolutely right. So we've got a major labor issue that's going to come out of this. In fact, the Department of Labor, Maine Department of Labor, is already projecting working age population as falling in the state. So that means all companies are going to have problems finding employees. And what I attribute it to, I basically say this is going to be the equivalent of a slow-moving economic depression. Because no matter how hard a business tries, there's simply going to be fewer and fewer people to be their customers. So if you run, say, a convenience store, the number of people coming in your doors every year is going to go down no matter how much you spend on advertising, no matter how much you work. There's simply fewer people around
to buy your
products. And that's the definition of a depression.
Oh, really?
When revenue declines, and there's nothing you can do about it,
so maybe
you'll certainly be depressed.
Maybe we can gain some fame for being #1 at the slow-moving depression.
Right along with West Virginia.
All right, so obviously we're not the only state in this situation.
Right.
Are we the worst off, or are there states worse off than we are as far as population decline and the aging population?
So currently only West Virginia is also seeing negative net population growth. So Maine and West Virginia, basically the only way you get population growth is by people moving into the state.
Right.
Now for Maine, that hasn't been happening because after the Great Recession, most of our in-migration comes from Boston. And when the housing market froze, people couldn't sell their house, they couldn't move to Maine. You see it also in New Hampshire and Vermont. So that's nothing new. And hopefully as the housing market thaws, we'll see more people coming in. But here's the problem. Massachusetts is just as old as we are. So most of the folks moving from Massachusetts are empty nesters, not the young couples who are going to have children. So it's not really a long-term solution.
So we're not attracting the reproducers. It's like we need to stop distributing condoms in school. No, I won't promote that policy, but right. It's not easy to start. Once you have lost that reproductive population, it's hard to rebuild it.
It's going to be hard to restart it unless you have start having very large families amongst those two.
Large families, or something that really attracts that right. young population, like an exceptional school, or you know, well, I don't know. You're the economist. You tell me what's going to turn
here's
this
the
around.
problem. Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont will be the first states going into this, but we're not the only state facing this problem. Most of the country is this because of the baby boomers.
Yes.
And they live everywhere. What I've read from economists is this is going to basically, we've been living in a sense off of the economic boom from the baby boomers.
Right. That's what's driven our economy.
That's right. A third of it, in fact. One study came out that said our long-term average growth rate has been about 3% as a country, year over year. 1 percentage point of that came from demographics alone. So our economic growth has been 2%, and then a 1%, call it a demographic dividend. Okay, now what they're saying is instead of a +1, we're going to now have a -1 headwind due to a demographic bust. So that 2% growth, subtract 1, you're looking at an average annual growth of 1% instead of 3%.
That's not good.
That's a huge swing. So that means we better get ready for more recessions, you know, because when you're at stall speed, which is what 1% is, 1% is basically stall speed on the economy, you're not really growing, that means you're going to see more dips into negative territory. So the whole country is going to be struggling economically moving forward, and then Maine is going to have to carve itself an economy out of that.
Well, do you know of any states that have kind of worked through this and figured out a better way to do it?
Nobody's consciously done that. You know, you even, again, you know, look at New Hampshire, no income tax, no sales tax, yet they're facing the same demographic bust.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot that government can in fact do, I think, when you're looking at a demographic crisis of this magnitude. You look at Western Europe, for example, which is already in this. I mean, the countries there where populations are already shrinking. Japan's already shrinking. Russia's already shrinking. You know, Russia pays you to have babies, and it's done nothing. It has not reversed their situation.
Well, China limits the number of babies. So where are they? Are they facing a similar situation because they've been cutting?
Yes, China's going to face, I mean, when they face their boom, it's going to be a cliff. I mean, their bust. It's just going to be a cliff because the one-child policy has not only reduced the number of children dramatically, China also has a preference for male babies. So they also have about a 30 million person imbalance of more men over women. Now, some people have hypothesized that that could lead to a very militaristic China in the future because you got 30 million men who basically can't find wives.
Or jobs.
Or jobs, perhaps. It's going to be a very shaky situation. So they've got twice the problem. And then as you were pointing out earlier, if you're missing 30 million women, where are they going to get babies from?
So they're facing a severe sustainability issue too. Mm-hmm. So is this part of a worldwide shrinkage of population? I mean, are we actually going to see, for example, when we get to 20 or 30 years down the road and we got 450,000 people over 65 in Maine, from there it's a downhill slope because those people are going to die off at a fairly rapid rate. And so the population of Maine could drop, what, 300,000 people in a decade or so?
Yes, and that is the problem with demographics. When you start to look at demographics, you know, we've all heard it on the overpopulation side. You know, they talk about how population growth is exponential. But what they don't talk about is the declines are also exponential. So you'll end up with these rapid drop-offs. And from an economic perspective, so much of our economic growth over the last 50 to 100 years, as I pointed out, has been simply due to there being more and more people and more customers. Now we're looking at possibly a whole century worth of the exact opposite.
I mean, that's a cliff. I mean, we're talking about in Maine going from 1.3 million down to somewhere close to 1 million. That's a lot of economics that won't take place. It's a lot of buying power and selling that will just not take place anymore in Maine.
And it hurts on both ends, not just on the demand side, but also on the supply side of labor. You know, and
labor costs will go up because of shortages.
I've heard this argument in Maine from other economists that, well, businesses will just pay more to attract more people.
Oh, yes.
But how is that possible if your revenue is also going down? And there's the catch-22 of demographic decline. And so, in my opinion, the people who are talking about overpopulation and were promoting, you know, population controls, were not fully thinking this through, because just as fast as population can grow, it can also bust. And that could basically pretty much halt the economy.
Like a bad chess game. I mean, somebody's only been thinking one move ahead, when the fact is they should be looking 4 or 5 moves ahead, 4 or 5 decades ahead in their economic projections.
Right. I mean, go back in history and look at the quote-unquote dark ages. The reason why they were so dark was because of the plagues. The plagues wiped out a third of the population.
The buying population.
Exactly. So Europe can never get their economy off the ground as long as people were dying at such a massive rate. Well, we're kind of going into a similar situation where population growth is no longer there to buttress economic growth. And we're going to find out just how important population growth is to economic growth.
I don't know. There's an economist out of Texas, Pam Villarreal, who actually came and did a presentation for us at the Economics of Aging in Maine that we did back in 2013. And she was talking about the shift in spending habits from pre-retirement to post-retirement. And the fact that seniors, especially, well, even as you get older, as you get in the 70s and 80s, what you choose to buy is based more on a very limited retirement plan, and you no longer have the ability to go back and work to replenish that money you're spending, so you spend less. You may be more selective. You may cut back on some of your dietary things and only go out to eat once every month instead of once every week. So not only is there that economic impact, and I'd love to know what her analysis shows today, but this is also a creeping depression, I mean, or recession at least. But this sounds terrifying. We all should be concerned. Is there a realistic solution? Because if Medicaid is going to double in spending, I assume Medicare will also have an increase. The shortage of workers is going to drive wage rates up. Profits are going to be down, so there'll be businesses operating on the skin of their teeth. And I'll be honest with you, Scott, that what I've seen from the small business owners here in Maine who are facing this reality, they're hoping that it will end at some point. But we're talking about a situation that's not going to end for 30 to 40 years. So this is you can't operate a business on a zero margin, on break even, for 30 or 40 years. You just can't do that.
Well, and for Maine, it's already a double whammy. In a lot of parts of the state, it's already a part-time economy because everybody packs up and heads to Florida during the winter. Well, when you compound that with the people who stay over the winter slowly dying off, companies' profit margins are already, as you point out, already razor thin. I mean, you know, we've made some progress on taxes, but let's face it, you know, taxes are still a problem, regulations are still a problem, and when you just so much as cut out 1% of sales, that's already enough to wipe out many businesses in Maine. Now, what's going to happen is, as the demographic winter takes further hold, those businesses, those services, like I've heard, it's already impossible in northern Maine to find electricians, a plumber, masons. You know, basically to keep your house functioning, it's already impossible to find those people. So what's going to happen to the second home market when people come here over the summer? They need their something fixed and they can't get it. They're going to throw up their hands and then try to sell their house.
You want to I don't know what your schedule is the rest of the day, but if you want an enlightening experience, go down to Kennebunk and drive Route 9 from Kennebunk to Kennebunkport and look at the number of mansions that are up for sale. I mean, there's got to be 50 to 100 mansions along that stretch that are up for sale. Those are well-to-do people who can no longer afford to keep those mansions in Maine.
Or they've decided they're going to start going to Florida. They've gotten over 60 or over 70, and while Maine is quaint, Florida is year-round. It's a year-round destination. A lot of people are deciding, go to Florida.
And the tax structure in Florida is?
No income tax. In fact, you bring that up. I was just watching television the other day, and there was a commercial advertising low-tax Florida. Come to Florida.
Absolutely.
Well, guess who they're targeting? People who live in northern New England. It was actually weather. I was watching the weather, and it was a commercial that came on. I was watching it through the internet. So that means, you can target these ads. They're targeting northern New England people, especially after this winter, right? I mean, how many people have fed up after this winter? And they're saying, hey, come to Florida, sunshine and no taxes.
So who do we target? The people in Canada? I mean, how do we get more seniors come to Maine? I honestly can remember 2 years ago, Charlie Colgan, one of your other economists
He's
in Maine.
now in Florida.
He's
California, I'm sorry.
Now in California. But he had said that if we handled the senior situation, the silver tsunami, properly, we could, in essence, become a destination point. But that was, as he said, it was a huge if. You couldn't fit into the back of a Chevy pickup.
Well,
it's a big if.
Well, and Colgan's whole analysis was based on bringing in federal money that were tied to those seniors. So he's looking for people on Medicare or Medicaid. The problem is, as I pointed out earlier, those aren't paying the freight on the cost that they actually incur. So if you're a hospital and you bring in 10 more patients and 9 out of the 10 are elderly, that's unsustainable.
Right.
You're losing money on each patient you see. How long do you think that can last?
Not very long, and we're already seeing some of that. I mean, a lot of the hospitals are marginal. We've had a couple of close this past year.
Well, and Governor LePage had to make that emergency infusion to keep nursing homes open. What was that? I believe it was $30 million?
$30 yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and even with that, the nursing homes are struggling because they are faced with this cost of labor going up. And I'll be honest with you, Scott. I mean, I work with a lot of the facilities in southern Maine, and the pressure, since most of them are owned by out-of-state firms right now, the pressure is to produce revenue. We got to have 100% census all the time, and got to be, producing more and more in revenue. So we've seen this huge turnover in management at dozens of facilities here in southern Maine. That's not healthy.
Right.
But since I raised it, I'll take a stretch here and go out on a limb, and probably some people will shoot me. But there's another drain on our economics here in Maine, and that is that out-of-state firms come in and buy up Maine businesses, Maine nursing homes, and what profit they do make ends up leaving the state. And right now it looks like an oil pipeline, and it's just draining retirement funds through the nursing homes right straight out into some other pocket. And so those are dollars that Maine will never get back. They're not being spent in Maine. They're not being invested in Maine. It's just a drain. And if you've watched what's happened in southern Maine, probably, I'd say 20 facilities have been bought by out-of-state firms in the past 2 to 5 years. That's the majority of out-of-state ownership. How is that going to be sustainable? Well, they're just going to soak it until it is no more.
And it's not just a money drain, but it's a brain drain. I remember a couple years ago, I got a tour of the Bridgeton area from a very concerned resident, and he was pointing out how the leaders of that community were all gone.
Yes.
They were all in Florida, for example. Now, you can't really put an economic cost to that, because these are the people who would be serving on nonprofit boards, making donations to nonprofit organizations, or building new businesses and employing new people. These were the business leaders of the community, and they were all gone. And so how do you quantify that to Maine's communities? And how do you keep them here, more importantly?
So you haven't had any great epiphanies about how to solve this. I know one that's on the table that I hear about all the time is called aging in place or thriving in place, depending on where you are. Have you heard that term?
Yes.
That's obviously a solution all around, isn't it?
Well, I mean, but that's a cost reduction of the problem, but it doesn't fundamentally solve the problem, which is we need more babies in Maine. We need more young people in Maine. Right now, the only solution is to somehow import them from other states.
How about other countries?
Possibly other countries as well, although that can create its own frictions depending on which countries you're talking about.
I mean,
Nonetheless,
we've got an immigration problem.
well, nonetheless, even Mexico, which is our #1 immigrant destination, they've also fallen below replacement rates.
Ouch.
Nobody's talked about that yet, but the fastest places where the birth rate is falling are in developing countries. So, of course, we talked about China already. That's a forced falling of the birth rate. Yep. But even in countries like Mexico and India, the birth rates are plummeting there as well. So this is a global problem, and Maine is just one part, one small piece of that demographic winter that's coming globally.
So I'm still waiting to hear the solution, Scott. I brought you on here because I figured you'd have all the answers, and we must have, at the federal level, we must have this solved somehow.
Well, here's the thing. We're talking about we're talking about the economic problems of demographic winter. But in all my research, there's only one variable that I've been able to find that relates to birth rates in America. Do you want to try to guess at what that is?
Population control?
Weekly church attendance.
Wait a minute. Whoa.
The states with the highest fertility rates.
What's going on at churches?
For example, are Utah. Utah has the highest fertility rate. And why?
Latter-day Saints.
Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. They have the highest birth rate in the country. New England, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, again, the least religious states in the country, according to the Pew Research. So,
well, this is interesting because a lot of people have been complaining about our Governor LePage cutting back on some welfare things, and especially in Portland. But I'm sure the other cities like Biddeford and Augusta and Lewiston all faced with the same situation. But a lot of what we call welfare nowadays used to be done by churches. Mm-hmm. And ever since we've gotten away from relying on churches to fill those roles, it seems like it's become more and more difficult to provide those services economically. I mean, didn't churches provide a lot of volunteers and a lot of time, and I think it was free?
That's right. I mean, churches were part of a larger civic ecology that we would take care of ourselves as opposed to having government. And that's absolutely right. Wherever you have seen government grow over a certain level, that's, Western Europe, for example. They've had bigger government for a lot longer than we have. Their demographic crisis is also more pronounced. So it's like, and then it spread to America when our government started getting bigger, started crowding out that rich civic ecology we used to have, whether it was churches or any of these fraternal organizations. You used to be able to buy, for example, your health insurance through your fraternal organization.
Interesting.
And not your company, not have to rely on your business. So the crowd out effect, and I've talked about that for years in other contexts, the crowd out is very real. And welfare and other government programs crowds out our civic institutions. And I think that's in large part a big problem. I mean, you look at the western states like Utah or in Idaho, and they have relatively smaller governments as well.
I grew up in Scarborough, which is not too far from here, but we always knew who the poor families were in town and the ones who needed help, and there were always a few indigents who needed some support, and they got it from a little bit from town hall for food and stuff, but almost always it was the Congregational Church or the Baptist Church or the Catholic Church. That was where people went to get help from their neighbors. And it was that social connection. Or they would go to the Grange. Mm-hmm. There was always Saturday nights, there was always a baked bean supper.
Or the town farm.
Or the town farm. I mean, we had all these tools in place back along, and now I'm wondering if we might go a little retro and get back into some of that. Certainly there's a movement towards more small farms and getting back to the roots of things. Maybe there's some positive future in that.
Absolutely, and you know, that was one solution I was toying with here in Maine, was maybe we need sort of a homestead movement like we had when we settled the West, for example. Get people back on the land. I mean, you drive up into the farm belt of Maine, and all you see are farmhouse after farmhouse falling in on itself. That land is reverting back to forest.
Right.
Why not take that land? You know, whether it's a government program or I'd rather see a private initiative, but why not have a private initiative that buys up that land and either give it away or very low price way, give it to young families who are willing to basically homestead?
I'm smiling because, as you know, Apple just went in with some of the conservation people here in Maine and bought up, like, I think it was 27,000 acres for conservation purposes. But that's the kind of private investment we need in drawing people back in to do some homesteading. Give them a little bit of a plot of land and a chance to grow their own vegetables, raise their own livestock. There's a lot of young people who are very interested in that lifestyle.
Well, based on what you just said, that's actually a problem, because they're taking land out of circulation.
Right.
And the one thing that Maine has in abundance is privately held land. You know, we're not the western states where 80% of the land is owned by the federal government. Maine, we actually have a chance. Small farms have been the legacy of Maine, and I definitely think there are some seeds in there that could be planted, no pun intended,
right,
that could grow and slow down the demographic problem.
So that's a really interesting concept, Scott. I mean, homesteading, the return to homesteading. Have you talked to other economists about that, or other think tanks? What's your feedback on?
I have. I've talked to a couple of people. I mean, it's just right now, number one, and I think for your show, there is not yet enough awareness of the coming demographic crash, first off, to make that connection. So first you have to convince people the demographic crisis is coming, and it is, and then you have to come up with the solutions. Problem is we haven't gotten past first base yet with this topic.
The awareness is absolutely zero.
Right. And here's the problem. As you know, it takes 18 years to grow a child, right? From zero to productive adult. At least 18 years if you talk about college and you talk about more. You need to start 18 years ago, before the problem hits. And that's the fundamental. That window is what we're missing right now. We're right, Maine in particular, we're right in the middle of that window. And when that time runs out, even solutions like that won't prevent a major decline in population, which will make homesteading even more difficult.
Well, certainly for immigration purposes, a homesteading concept would be very desirable, I would think, to get some immigrants, just come in and be productive in the way that our founders originally were.
Well, I've heard that there's already some movement afoot. I hear the Amish are moving into northern Maine.
Well, there is an Amish population up around Presque Isle, and what I do know is that the McCain's brings in Mexicans to harvest some crops and tend the fields and stuff. Where it used to be Haitians, now we're importing Mexicans to do that. So if we were to give them the opportunity to have their own place and help McCain, maybe we'd kill two birds with one stone.
Absolutely.
But I like that idea of homesteading. I'm concerned about this aging in place concept because it sounds like it may distract people from the real problem. If it sounds like there's a solution on the table and that aging in place is going to solve all these problems, I just don't want to cover up the fact that this is a bigger problem than just aging in place. This is not about where you go for your health care. It's about the cost and the availability of people to provide health care.
Aging in place won't help if you can't find the nurses, you can't find the doctors, you can't find the other infrastructure. These folks are still going to pack up and head to Florida, where the services will be more abundant than they are here in Maine. And that's the fundamental problem, that none of those are all Band-Aids. but we're still hemorrhaging people, and that's the problem.
For our audience, I wanted to just let you know we've talked about PACE a couple of shows ago, the program for all-inclusive services for the elderly. And I brought that to Scott's attention. I'm hoping that I can educate him a little bit on that, because that's another CMS program which involves Medicaid, Medicare, and private pay, which he may not have planned on including in his study. But that's something that the MemoryWorks and the Dementia Care Coalition here in Southern Maine are trying to work on. We're actually going to encourage, meet with Mary Mayhew next week and talk about how we can implement that. I think what's holding it up is an actuarial study, oddly enough, if you'd like to borrow it. I think we're going to end up paying for it. So, but we are trying to do some other things in the education area. We're looking at doing a health sciences charter school that will pick kids up at 8th grade and start teaching them health sciences with a big emphasis, and then feed that into a health science institute so that these kids can come on at grade 8 and have a career ladder where they can get off at any point where a business says, I need an RN in 3 years. We want to target people on that ladder and say, in 3 years you'll have a job at Joe's nursing facility. And sort of get the businesses to sponsor that, because the student debt nowadays, that's another hidden tax. It's going to kill the kids who are coming out of college now. I don't know how kids are going to pay for their debt. So we want to try to do that in cooperation with businesses to try to offset some of the wage increases that we're going to see. But we're also trying to do a whole bunch of other things, and so I hope you'll pay attention to some of our future shows and stuff. But just a couple things to finish up, Scott. This is going to leave a lot of people who see this very depressed. What do you see that you're going to be working on to help address this issue down the road? Are you able to talk to Congress, to Senator Collins' committee, to state legislatures?
Well, this is exactly why we do need this actuarial analysis we mentioned at the beginning of the show. And New Hampshire will be the pilot. We hope to roll it out in other states. And the end goal is to have states doing this, just like they do with their pension systems, public pension systems, a 30-year, full-blown actuarial analysis, so we know the problem that's coming. And number one, until we know the problem, we can't come up with solutions. And that's what I was saying before. People just aren't aware of the demographic crisis coming or how it's going to filter down to Medicaid. People don't know that Medicaid pays for long-term care, for example. So we've got a lot of education to do moving forward. And that's our first goal at State Budget Solutions is first, we got to educate on this. And then hopefully we can get people's attention to start talking about solutions. Because, I'm very interested in all these programs you're working on, because we're going to have to bend the cost curve back. Because, frankly, if taxes are only going to go higher, like right now, Maine's income tax, individual income tax, basically pays for the Medicaid system.
What pays for the rest of it?
Right. The sales tax pays for all the other stuff. So what's going to happen if Medicaid continues to grow? We're going to have another tax on top of the income tax, or just a really big income tax? No, because what happens is as the income tax continues to increase, Florida starts looking even better.
And there's no quick fix for helping to move people from the poverty level or the income level where they need to live off Maine care to a better situation where they may not have to. That's not an easy move either. So we're kind of in a corner, and I think everybody's looking for ways out. But I'll tell you folks, in senior centers around Southern Maine, when you see an 85-year-old lady who has been in a facility for 10 years and is now alone, and she sees her retirement funds running out, what do you do? What do you do when you're 85 and healthy, and the home that you've been living in for years comes along and says, by the way, you've only got 4 months worth of money left? What do? You know, if you're young, even at my age, I'm not young, but even at my age, it would be a challenge to suddenly go out and find something that would pay enough to allow me to stay there. I mean, we're talking most nursing homes in Maine are around $6,000 to $10,000 a month. What kind of jobs? There aren't even jobs in Maine that pay that well. So we're actually seeing 85-year-olds and older filing bankruptcy to get out of this trouble. But even then, they have to go on Maine Care, Medicaid, and there aren't nursing home beds available. So pick your bridge early, put cardboard, line it with cardboard, maybe get some insulation, because I don't see where these folks are going. I just don't see it. And you know, and it's not a small problem. This is happening in every nursing home across the state.
Yeah. You know, I hate to reinforce the term dismal scientist here and being the economist. And again, I'm just the messenger here.
No, we're going to shoot you anyway.
I have 4 children with 1 on the way, so I'm trying to fix the problem personally.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, I am doing something about it. I'm not the complete dismal scientist, but nonetheless, Robert Kiyosaki, he's famous for writing Rich Dad, Poor Dad. You know, he came out and he's also aware of this demographic crisis. And, you know, if you're 60 right now and you've got all this money in a 401k, you should be concerned, because when you and all your brethren who are the same age start pulling out of that 401k, guess what's going to happen to the stock market?
Oh, absolutely.
It's going to go in reverse.
Because the plan's got to sell assets to liquidate to pay off their nursing home debt.
That's right. And so you can't even guarantee that the nest egg you have today will last nearly as long as you're anticipating, because the stock market's going to be facing negative headwinds, just like the economy in general. And I'm not even factoring into the fact that if we do only grow at 1%, well, you know, that means corporate profits are down, all of that, which also affects the stock market.
A friend of mine at Edward Jones said to me, he said, there's another problem that people aren't aware of, and that is in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when people were preparing their retirement plans, the life expectancy was 72 to 75. Medicare, I think, was based on something similar. Mm-hmm. But now, if you look at what the real population is, there's a lot of people who live in way beyond 75. They're fastest growing segments of our population are people 80, 90, or 100. Those are just 100. People over 100 are growing dramatically. Now, if you retired at 65 and you're now 105, you're well beyond the odds. But what do you do for the next 30 years? I mean, I don't know what people are expecting to do in retirement. If you retire at 65 and you're going to live 30 more years, that's almost another career. You can only watch I'm convinced, you can only watch so much Oprah and so much Dr. Phil and so much Law and Order before you really got to find something else to do.
And there are easy policy fixes for that we can't even make today. Like Social Security, for example, you're penalized if you work over, I forget the exact age, but you pay a penalty. That should be fixed right now.
Oh, okay.
That should just be thrown out. We should be encouraging people to work for as long as they possibly want to or even physically can.
That's a federal fix?
That's a federal fix.
Okay.
It could be done tomorrow just like that. But no politician wants to rattle the senior level.
Oh, my God.
Nonetheless, it's a fix that could be made. It's not even a fix that hurts people. It actually helps them.
Right.
Because they could continue to build their nest egg further, as you were pointing out, so they don't have to cover 30 years. Maybe they don't have 25 or 20.
It sounds like it solves a lot of problems because it brings more people back into the workforce.
It would. But the problem is it's a Depression-era policy where back in the Great Depression, their goal was to try to get people out of the labor force so they could shrink unemployment.
Gotcha.
But of course, you were talking back then about the extreme elderly anyways. The lifespan was much, much shorter back then. But today, you're right, we're facing 30 years in retirement. That's unsustainable no matter how you slice it.
I haven't figured out yet what I would do with an extra 30 years, to be honest with you. It's almost unfathomable to expect to live to 100 or, there's people who are 120 now. Holy cow. I mean, anyway. So Scott, I want to thank you for coming. I know you're on your way back to, I don't know if it's New Hampshire or D.C., but
New Hampshire.
It's raining down in Massachusetts. But I want to thank you for coming and sharing your wisdom, and maybe we can have you back when you do find the solution, because it's all on your shoulders, just so you know. But no, I'm hoping that economists can make an impact on what our government does, and as you said, some of the easy fixes should be done, and then we'll work on some of the hard fixes. But we all got to work together. I'll be honest with everybody out there. We've all got to work together. No silos, no artificial walls and barriers. We've got to work across all domains to make this work. And if we don't start now, it's not going to get better. So, you know, join up. Give us a call. Sign up on memoryworks.org. Go check out Scott's site, www.statebudgetsolutions.org. And come back and see us every week. We're going to give you a constant update on what's happening economically and socially with our seniors. So thank you for this week's show. Scott?
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.